We often don't recognize how the way we think about free will is deeply connected to the way we think about other phenomena, including social phenomena and including everyday life world phenomena. This is not just a theoretical question that is of interest to a few philosophers, but it expresses the general way of how we think about reality as a whole, and it is actually also an expression for why we are in such big trouble as a society today. Take the argument against the existence of free will. The major point that determinism is making is that events are basically physically determined. So whenever you have one event, that event must be the result of a prior event, and how that prior event, through its causal powers, made the event to be what it is. There is no existence out of nothing. All existence is the result of one event following a different event and being connected to it by external causal powers that determine the way it is. And there are many ways of looking at this. Of course, the trivial examples that are often given is in terms of particle physics. So smaller particles are more foundational and causative for the behavior of bigger particles. So when you understand reality on the level of the smaller, you supposedly also understand it on the level of the bigger. There seems to be a causal chain that goes all the way down, and all the way down here literally means into the smallest observable whatever exists. This is the major argument for determinism, and it's not much of an argument, it's basically a postulation. It's the postulation that reality is causally determined, and since it's causally determined, you have defined that there couldn't ever be anything else but physical properties which are determining an object's behavior and the features and the structure of a given event. You've basically excluded everything else as being possibly involved in the course of history. Now, this is very similar in nature to the way we think and we argue about social phenomena. When you take the present-day conflict between Israel and Palestine, for example, many are making the point that October the 7th was not the beginning, but it had a prior history, and that you have to look at a specific different event to then understand why October the 7th had to happen. And the similarity here in both ways of arguing is that we're reducing reality down to something that is linear and something that we can grasp with our minds. So we're reducing October the 7th to one phenomenon or a group of phenomena that supposedly caused it. And whenever we do that, and we can really feel this when it comes to social conflict, there is always another side which says, no, these are not the crucial events that caused October the 7th, but you have to look at a very different group of events. You have to not only look at history and at economy, but you have also to raise the question about responsibility, about choices being made, about self-identity. And whenever it comes to the question, who's right in this given situation, it seems that everybody, as Wilber puts it, is right a bit. Everybody seems to have a point, but no one seems to have the overall picture. And it seems it's possible to look at one event and come up with endlessly many different explanations why this event actually had to occur. And this has something to do with the nature of our minds. If you ask and dig deeper, ask questions about what is actually causality itself, it turns out we don't really know. Even though we kind of know what causality is, we can't really explain how it functions, and its inner workings are not transparent. Even to such a degree, oftentimes, is it intransparent to us that it's almost a magical word. And when we feel that we have a causal explanation for something, we oftentimes feel we have explained the phenomenon, and there is nothing else to explain. It is fully transparent. But the examples that are usually given for causality are themselves mostly working on the level of the life world and intuitions. They are not precise arguments. If you want to make somebody understand what causality is, you can use a physical example, of showing how two objects are related to each other and how one object bumping into another object causes this second object to do something else, since they can't occupy the same space at the same time. But you can also make the argument by pointing to psychological phenomena, like, for example, having a belief or not having a belief in a certain situation makes the difference to what you will do in a certain situation. So it has some form of causal power over what happens in reality. The same thing goes with social phenomena. One group of people believing something collectively has consequences as to what this group of people will actually do. And this is as much causality as you can get. This is not weaker causality than the physical causality. At the end of the day, it's the same thing. If you ask physicists to explain their form of causality, at the end of the day, they also point to something like the life world, something that is immediately graspable and something that a small child can understand. And if the child can't understand it, there is no way of explaining it to the child. There are certain basic foundations of how we make sense of reality which have to be grasped immediately, or they will never be grasped and they will never be understood, no matter how good you explain them to an individual. And that's the common ground, or this is the shared, if you want, relationship between questions about free will that seem not related at all to questions about everyday reality. But at the end of the day, in both cases, they are expression of how we reduce reality down to something that we can pin down, something that intuitively makes sense, and how we attempt to form something that is a complex situation into linear connections that to us are graspable. And linear connections are something that we can understand, something that we can literally see. We can imagine them as push-pull causality, almost as if there is a line or a cord between the two phenomena, and when you pull on the one phenomenon, you pull the other phenomenon together with it. So we have this linear connection between. This is something that our minds are used to, and this is something that our minds can do. But reality is not composed of such events. It is not composed of events that have just linear reasons. And when we try to understand what causality actually is, it turns out we don't know. It turns out we don't know why one event follows another. We just see they do, but we can't even point out to the necessity why one event has to have the exact features it has after it appears following another event. We don't know. And this flaw in how we think about reality actually causes us, on a social level, to fragment, because everybody chooses their own favorite assumptions as to what reality is composed of and what makes sense in reality. And just as the examples with the primary intuitions about causation, these intuitions are intuitively graspable. They are plausible. They make sense. You just point it immediately out and you say, yeah, of course, obviously there seems to be physical causality. But the same thing is true of the other side, of the more idealist position, for example, in the question of free will. That, for example, looking at the expressions of mind itself, there are many examples that you could give where mental phenomena seem to have equally valid causal powers as the physical examples that we can give. And the same thing with social phenomena. When you make your point and think you have figured history out and figured out what the reasons for a specific conflict are, there will always be a different side which will point to entirely different events, and within their local descriptions and punctual descriptions, they have similarly strong intuitions about what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. So how would we find to each other if it doesn't work by just simply postulating one way of treating reality or treating it in a different way, one linear narrative over a different linear narrative? How could we approach this and find ways to come together or have any kind of meaningful exchange? Because the same thing that you see in the academic disciplines, like the free will debate, for example, where you have different camps emerging who can't stand each other and who spend most of their time trying to refute the other side. Something very similar is happening in our everyday life, where camps are emerging, tribes are emerging. All of them have the feeling that they're in touch with absolute reality. And all of them spend a significant amount of time, like Thomas Aquinas did actually, trying to disprove the other side, right? Thomas Aquinas could spend days thinking about how to disprove the unbelievers or the non-believers, right? And something similar we are doing. So it seems to be part of human nature that we are trying to figure out how to get rid of that annoyance of the other side and getting the other side to our side, while not really understanding what we're actually doing here,